Osio, Dylan Hedden-Nicely, Dakwadoa, Tsalagi, Ayeli, Kayla, Galagwo, Diuhno, Agiwo, Nihisti, Nihi, Iga Yidigla, Nista, Danai, Kohiiga, Wado. Greetings, welcome. My name is Dylan Hedden-Nicely. I'm an associate professor at the University of Idaho, where I manage our Native American law program. And I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about the concept of tribal sovereignty. This is something that I've spent my entire career thinking about, studying about, and I think it's also one of the most misunderstood concepts within American government and American law. And I think a lot of that comes from and stems from how we were taught American government from the very beginning. And we were taught that American government, our constitutional system, bifurcated government between two groups of governments: the states, the individual states of the Union, as well as the United States, and that those two entities share sovereignty between themselves. Related to that is the history of how the United States went about acquiring the land that we all live on today. And so, for example, when I was in high school, I was taught that the United States just magically had the eastern United States as well as the old Northwest. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson acquired the Louisiana Territory from France through the Louisiana Purchase. Then later on in the 1840s and 1850s, the United States acquired the Southwest, Texas, and the Oregon Territory through a series of agreements with other European nations. But of course, in actuality, by the time the United States was born, the country looked something more like this. It was covered with indigenous people that had been here for millennia, people that were broken up into their own groups, that had their own governments, their own ways of living, their own ways of life. And they controlled their territory, they owned their land, and within their own exterior boundaries, they had governments. As the Supreme Court recognized all the way back in the 1830s, America was inhabited by distinct people, divided into separate nations, independent from each other and the rest of the world, having institutions of their own and governing themselves by their own laws. And so, in actuality, the way that the United States was acquired looked something like this, where not only did the United States enter into agreements with other European nations, the agreement that they entered into was essentially a right of exclusive purchase from the indigenous people that actually owned the lands of the United States, or what would become known as the United States. And that's something that the United States federal government did in a very aggressive manner for a period of essentially since the country was born in the 1780s, all the way through the early 20th century into the 1920s and even into the 1930s. And so what this image shows, it's an image that was produced by Slate.com based upon research that was conducted by Professor Claudio Sante. And what it shows is over a period of 100 plus years, how the United States actually went about acquiring all of this land. And so the blue land is lands that are held by tribes. It's what's known as Aboriginal title. And then as the blue disappears, it's showing the United States acquiring land from individual tribes. And finally, the red shows the remaining lands that are held by the tribes after these acquisitions. And the land acquisition was massive. In 1491, a recent article that was produced by the journal Science estimated that in 1491, indigenous people owned and occupied somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.73 billion acres of land within what is today the continental United States. Essentially all of the land of the continental United States. Today, that ownership has been reduced to somewhere in the neighborhood of 105 million acres, a reduction of 93.9% of the entire land base of this country. Idaho looks something similar. And so what we're used to seeing is a map that looks something like this with the exterior boundaries of the state of Idaho and 5 reservations located within the state. And so on the north side, from the very north end of the state, we have the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho's reservation. Moving south, the Coeur d'Alene Tribe's reservation. Moving more south, the Nez Perce Tribes Reservation. All the way down on the Idaho-Nevada border is the Shoshone-Paiute Tribes, the Duck Valley Reservation. And then moving over into eastern Idaho, we have the Fort Hall Reservation, which is home to the Shoshone and Bannock tribes. As recently as 1855, this state looked something more like this. For one thing, in 1855, there was no state boundary. And for another, the land was owned and occupied by those tribes. And so once again, up in the Panhandle, the Kootenai tribe owned a piece of that land. Further down, the Kalispel tribes and the Pend Oreilles owned a piece of what is today the state of Idaho. Then the Coeur d'Alene tribe, Nez Perce tribe, and then further down still, the Shoshones, the Bannocks, as well as the Paiute peoples. And they owned all of the land within this state. The United States, just as it did elsewhere within this country, came in and negotiated agreements for the cession of those lands so that non-Indian settlers could live here, but at the same time ensure that the tribes continued to have homelands where they could live as well. How did they do that? The way that they did that was through treaties. Now, this is important for two reasons. One, it's important because it demonstrates that European nations viewed tribes as sovereigns. Treaties are agreements between sovereign nations. And therefore, by using treaties, what the United States was doing was recognizing that the tribal nations in this case were sovereigns on equal footing to the other governments of Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. These treaties are also important because they memorialize the rights that the tribes ceded away, but perhaps just as important, they memorialize the rights that the tribes retained or reserved unto themselves. And so starting with this second point, again, remembering the quote from the Supreme Court decision that the tribes owned and occupied and controlled all of the land and all of the incidents of those lands, all the property rights to hunt, fish, gather, use that land however they saw fit. They start from that premise, and then the question is, well, what is the tribe willing to give up to the United States? Put another way, treaties are not a grant of rights to the Indians, but a grant of rights from them, and a reservation of those not granted. This is from a case from the early 20th century in the U.S. Supreme Court. And so any rights that the tribe does not expressly cede away in these agreements should be viewed as having been retained by the tribes. Let me give you an example. Starting with the Nez Perce tribe. What this map shows is the Aboriginal territory of the Nez Perce tribe, the territory within which the tribe owned and occupied since time immemorial. That's the area that you can see there that is crosshatched. And it encompasses most of north central Idaho, much of eastern Oregon, as well as eastern Washington. And even though it does not show it here, Nez Perce tribe also occupied and controlled lands within western Montana as well. In 1855, the Nez Perce tribe entered into a treaty with the United States. And in that treaty, they agreed to cede all but 7.5 million acres of their Aboriginal territory. That Aboriginal territory was approximately 17 million acres in extent. And so therefore, what they ceded away was a 9.5 million acres of land. And so the reservation that they retained in 1855, you can see on this map, is the larger red line that's on this picture. And so what did they get in exchange for that cession of 9.5 million acres of land? Everything that's in crosshatch that is outside of that red line. Well, the first thing they got was they received compensation, monetary compensation, in the amount of $200,000. And so $200,000 for 9.5 million acres of land amounts to approximately 2 cents per acre. And so obviously, the money was not the primary motivation for why the Nez Perce tribe entered into this agreement. So what was it? Well, let's look to see what else the tribe's treaty guaranteed. The first thing that it guaranteed was a homeland. the reservation that I was just talking about, the 1855 reservation of approximately 7.5 million acres. That homeland was to be reserved for the tribe's exclusive use and benefit, a place where they could go and live within their homeland, within their Aboriginal homeland, could continue to live their way of life according to their own laws and customs, but also to continue to evolve just like everybody else. The tribe also reserved unto themselves the exclusive right to fish in the streams of the reservation, as well as the right to fish at all usual and accustomed places outside of their reservation within their historical fishing territory. In addition to fishing, the Nez Perce tribe also reserved unto themselves, and the United States agreed to reserve for them, for their benefit, the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries, as well as pasturing their horses and cattle upon open and unclaimed lands within the United States, even outside of their reservation. And so these are all things that that were important to the tribe, and in exchange for the cession of 9.5 million acres, the United States and the tribe agreed that the tribe would be able to do into perpetuity. And you can see these are all really important things that are necessary for the tribe to be able to continue to live its way of life. We agree to cede these lands that we've had since time immemorial, that our ancestors have been living on for millennia. But what we want is a homeland where we can continue to live. And we want to be able to continue to live according to our own ways of life outside of the reservation and continue to do the things that have always been important to us as a people. Now, the tribe also negotiated for schools as well as other educational implements, things like mills and people that would come onto the reservation to help the tribes develop their economies so that the tribe could not only subsist a traditional manner, but could also continue to develop their economies and develop their reservations so that they could continue to evolve as a people and evolve as an economic unit. Let me give you another example. This one's from southeastern Idaho. This is the Fort Hall reservation, home to the Shoshone and Bannock tribes. Now, today, the reservation is around 580,000 acres in extent, but historically, the tribe owned and controlled somewhere in the neighborhood of around 55 million acres of land. Essentially all of southern Idaho, portions of Nevada and Utah, and even into Wyoming and Montana. So a huge territory that these tribes traditionally controlled. In exchange for the cession of that territory, they were provided no compensation. There was no compensation involved in the treaty, the cession treaty, or the treaty that where the United States agreed to create the Fort Hall Reservation. Instead, what they negotiated for was a permanent homeland. The Shoshone and Bannock tribes wanted to make Fort Hall their permanent homeland, and that was where the United States agreed that it would be placed. In addition to that, once again, just like the Nez Perce tribe, the Shoshone and the Bannock tribes wanted to be able to continue their traditional ways of life. And so they reserved unto themselves the right to hunt on all of the unoccupied lands of the United States. Now, ostensibly, the word hunt would only include hunting as English speakers would view the term. So literally to hunt terrestrial game, not things like gathering roots and berries or things like fishing for salmon in the streams. And this came up in an Idaho Supreme Court case where the state of Idaho ticketed a Shoshone Bannock tribal member for fishing outside of the reservation on the Yankee Fork of the Salmon River. And that tribal member named Tenno argued that his right to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the reservation also included the right to fish outside of the reservation on unoccupied lands. And the way that Tenno proved this and this was the evidence that the Idaho Supreme Court found to be very persuasive, was we interpret treaties as the tribe would have understood it. And Tenno produced evidence, linguistic evidence, that demonstrated that neither the Shoshones nor the Bannocks used words that differentiated between hunting and fishing. And so even though we that are English speakers use different words, hunting means one thing, fishing means another thing, for the Shoshones and Bannocks that were negotiating this treaty, their words were just literally procure food. And so therefore, the Idaho Supreme Court concluded that a Shoshone-Bannock negotiator would not have understood hunting to not include fishing. And as a matter of fact, I have friends on the Fort Hall Reservation that continue to fish in the traditional way, and they don't refer to fishing as fishing for salmon. Instead, they refer to it as hunting for salmon. And when you watch them, because they're spearing, when you watch them, that's really what they're doing. They're not fishing in the way that Westerners would think about fishing. They're literally stalking fish, finding them, finding where they're located, and sneaking up on them and spearing them as though they were hunting them. But ultimately, as a result of this difference in knowing, in understanding, but the Idaho Supreme Court's recognition of that difference, they ultimately concluded that the English terminology would have been understood by the Shoshones and the Bannocks to encompass both fishing and hunting for game. Finally, just like the Nez Perce Treaty, the Treaty of Fort Bridger includes a promise by the United States that it would construct a schoolhouse or mission building. And so once again, the tribes are not thinking only about reserving their traditional way of life, but also about how that way of life is going to change as a result of this coming of a new group of people, and how they need to be competitive in that new world, and how they can continue to develop their own homeland, their own economy, so that they can be successful moving into perpetuity as they always had been. The second reason why treaties are important is because they demonstrate that European countries and later the United States recognized tribal governments as sovereigns. And that language, that homeland language that we talked about for both the Nez Perce tribe as well as the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, repeats itself over and over and over again. And so just a couple of examples from Idaho, starting up north. At the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, the United States agreed that the reservation shall be held forever as Indian land and as homes for the Coeur d'Alene Indians. As we've already mentioned in the 1855 treaty, the Nez Perce Reservation was guaranteed for the tribe's exclusive use and benefit. The Duck Valley Reservation, home to the Shoshone and Paiute peoples in southern Idaho and northern Nevada, was set apart as a reservation specifically for the Western Shoshones. And as we've already talked about in the 1868 Treaty of Fort Bridger, the Fort Hall Reservation was set aside as the permanent homeland for the Shoshone and Bannock peoples. Now, when we're talking about homelands in this situation, or in this case, we're not just talking about homes like you and I would think about homes. We're talking about a place where a group of people can go and live according to their own ways of life, with their exterior boundaries of their lands well determined, well defined, and within which the tribes have control over the territory and the people. And so, for example, in the 50s and 60s, interpreting the 1868 treaty with the Navajo, which also guaranteed that the Navajo Reservation would continue to be the permanent home of the Navajo people. The Supreme Court found in Williams versus Lee, the first case, that implicit in those treaty terms, that the Navajo Reservation would continue to be the homeland for the Navajo tribe, was the understanding that the internal affairs of the Indians, the Navajo Nation, would remain exclusively within the jurisdiction of whatever tribal government existed. Just a few years later, interpreting that same treaty language, that homeland language, the Supreme Court found that the right to a permanent home included from the very first days of our government the right of the tribes to govern themselves and free from state interference. This pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. So much so that one of the leading treatises on federal Indian law, Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law, has drawn out patterns or maxims or canons related to tribal power, tribal sovereignty. And the first of those is that Indian tribes possess, in the first instance, all powers of a sovereign state. But subject to that qualification, the full powers of internal sovereignty remain vested in the tribes. As a result of that governmental power that tribes retain, we continue to recognize that Indian tribes are distinct, independent political communities, retaining their original rights in matters of local self-government. So what do? What do tribes do with these rights? With great power comes great responsibility, right? What do these governments look like? What do they do to help their people? What do they do to help communities more broadly? Every tribe has a different governmental structure. For example, the Coeur d'Alene tribe has a tribal council. That council is composed of 7 members. There is also a chairman of the tribal council that forms the executive branch of their government. And so the executive and the legislative branch shares responsibilities. And then there is a separate judicial branch, a Coeur d'Alene tribal court. In contrast, the Navajo Nation, for example, has a tribal council that has 24 members, quite a bit larger. They also have a traditional 3-part governmental structure. And by traditional, I mean traditional in the sense that it mirrors the United States' traditional governmental structure of 3 parts. And so they have a legislative branch, the tribal council. They have a Navajo Nation president. And then they have a robust Navajo Nation judiciary with both trial level courts as well as appellate courts. In addition to tribal legislative branches, many tribes also have judicial branches. And so, for example, this is the Fort Hall Justice Center. It's located on the Fort Hall Reservation, home to the Shoshone and Bannock tribes. And as you can see, it's a modern, beautiful building. It was built in the late 1990s, early 2000s, somewhere in there. Here's a picture of the inside of the courtroom. And so as you can see, anybody that's familiar with what the inside of a courtroom looks like, it looks very much like a courtroom that you would see in a state or federal court. And the proceedings that take place there are very similar to what you would expect to see in a regular state or federal court. Now, that's not to say that every tribal court system is this way. Some tribes have very traditional ways of resolving disputes, and they do not adopt a tribal court system as we might recognize it as non-members of the tribe. Many courts have healing and wellness courts where the focus is less on punishment and retribution and more on reconciliation and healing. And so tribes as governments have the power to develop those types of programs and to institute judicial proceedings, peacemaker proceedings, dispute resolution proceedings that are more consistent with their own traditional practices and the things that they're culturally most comfortable with. Tribes also engage in law enforcement. So this is a picture of a Nez Perce tribal police officer. Every tribe within the state of Idaho has a police force. These police officers are all either trained by the Idaho Post Academy, which is the peace officer standards and training academy that all Idaho law enforcement officers go through, or they're trained with the federal law enforcement training centers across the United States. And so many of these police officers, these tribal police officers, actually have training in excess of what some of our state officers have. These officers are oftentimes cross-deputized with county sheriff's offices. And so that means that they can enforce the law on their reservation across the board, regardless of whether the person that they are working with or potentially arresting is a tribal member or a non-Indian. In addition to providing law enforcement, tribes all over the country provide emergency medical services as well as fire suppression services. And so this shows a patch from the Shoshone-Paiute Fire Department. Tribes also have, in addition to urban fire suppression units like this one, they also engage in wildland fire suppression as well. And so, for example, when there's a fire on or near the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, the Coeur d'Alene tribe will send firefighters out to either assist or be on point for putting that fire out, along with the Forest Service, BLM, as well as state fire suppression personnel. In addition to that, tribes provide emergency medical services, ambulance services, etc. Concomitant with that, tribes provide general medical services. And so, for example, this picture here shows Mariman Health Center on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation. And Mariman Health Center is not only a traditional Indian health services facility specifically for tribal members, but it's also a community health center that is there for non-tribal member community members. And it provides medical, dental, vision, as well as behavioral health. And the most recent statistics I could find from 2017 showed that they served around 2,500 tribal members in that year, as well as 3,500 tribal employees that were both members and non-members. And then they served about that many non-member people from the community as well. So around 5,000 non-Indian community members went to that facility to receive medical treatment. That makes this medical center the largest medical center between Coeur d'Alene and Moscow, and is a vital part of the North Idaho medical infrastructure. Tribes are also engaged in management of the fish and wildlife, as well as the plants that are important to them for both traditional as well as subsistence, as well as cultural purposes. One of the big things that tribes do is they have hatcheries. Nez Perce tribe has either ownership or management control over a number of hatcheries, including the Doorshack National Fish Hatchery. The tribe invests over $37 million per year in that hatchery, and those fish are then harvested by not only tribal members, but non-members as well. Tribes also manage other natural resources. This is a picture of a trip I was on with the Coeur d'Alene Tribe Department of Natural Resources. And so everything within, for example, the Coeur d'Alene Tribe within the reservation, as well as all of the natural resources issues that affect the reservation, the Coeur d'Alene Tribe is involved in. And so that includes timber management. That includes things like agricultural leases, as well as managing land for agricultural purposes. That includes wetlands and stream restoration to protect plants and animals, as well as aquatic species, and other things to ensure that the environment on and near the reservation continues to be viable and self-sustaining, and continues to allow the tribes to engage in their traditional ways of life, but also ensures that non-members can enjoy the benefits of that clean environment as well. Consistent with the treaty promises, as well as the tribe's own vision for their own future, tribes are engaged in extensive educational opportunities. This picture here is an image from the Chief Tagee Elementary down at the Fort Hall Reservation. Tribes have schools on each of the reservations within Idaho and around the country, where they are now managing their own educational resources and helping their young people to build the educational tools that they need in order to be successful and either come back and help their communities or go off and help their own families. Tribes, as governments, are also engaged in significant infrastructure projects. So, for example, on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, there's the Red Spectrum Internet Company. That's an Indian-owned company that provides internet throughout the Coeur d'Alene Reservation. As you may know, reservations are one of the places that has the least access to internet, which is necessary in order for people to engage in a modern economy. And so tribes are building their own infrastructure as governments in this arena and ensuring that their members and their businesses have the informational infrastructure necessary in order to be successful. So that's like cutting-edge 21st century infrastructure, but tribes are also just engaged in the basic infrastructure of building roads, canals, power, etc., sewer, within their reservation. And so this picture here shows the road and housing construction being done on the Duck Valley Indian Reservation. For this project, the tribes were engaging in the construction of not only roads, but also housing projects for the benefit of their members. And part of that infrastructure was also wastewater treatment as well as water quality. This picture shows a wastewater treatment facility on the Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation near the Coeur d'Alene Casino. At the time it was built, and to this day, it continues to be one of the most cutting-edge wastewater treatment facilities in the country. And this is, again, infrastructure that is necessary in order for communities to be viable communities in the 21st century. And tribes are taking it upon themselves to build, manage, and operate these different pieces of important infrastructure. Tribes are actively engaged in environmental restoration. I talked a little bit about this when we were talking about natural resources. Tribes all over the country are engaged in stream restoration, wetlands restoration, and all of the things that are necessary in order to ensure that their homelands continue to be viable places. And finally, tribes are engaged in supporting their young people. And so what this picture shows is the Core Center that was built just a few years ago in Worley, Idaho. Tribe commissioned a study and found that most of their young people were getting into trouble between the hours of 3 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock in the afternoon, i.e. the time where they are out of school, but their parents are not out of work. And so they decided to commission the construction of this center that is a half gymnasium, aquatic center, and half a Boys and Girls Club. It's an amazing facility that is being used by its membership every day, and it's open to the general public and has provided an amazing resource for all of the community members within the reservation. And similarly, this picture shows the Shoshone-Paiute Daycare Center at the Duck Valley Reservation. And so what I hope you'll take away from this is that American law and American government is not made up just of the interrelationship between state and federal law and state and federal governments, but instead is a three-part relationship. We have state, federal, and tribal laws, and we have to examine the interrelationship between state, federal, and tribal governments. And so our takeaway for today is that since time immemorial, America has been inhabited by a distinct people, indigenous people, divided into separate nations, independent of each other and independent of the rest of the world, having institutions of their own and governing themselves by their own laws. Undoubtedly, in the 21st century, tribal government is different than it was at our country's founding. Tribal government and tribal authority has been circumscribed. However, tribes continue to have governmental authority over both their people and their lands, and conversely, state authority within Indian reservations is very limited. Although the governance structure of the 574 plus tribes in this country is unique, every tribe is different. Most tribal governments that we interact with have typical Western democracies with three-part governmental structures, including a judicial, executive, and legislative branch. Tribes provide extensive governmental services, often, in many cases on Indian reservations, to a greater degree than both the states or the federal governments. And those services benefit everyone within the community, both tribal members as well as non-Indians. And so with that, I would like to thank you by saying Wado for being here with me today. I hope that you understand a little bit more about the history related to tribes and tribal sovereignty. And I want to leave you with the idea that ultimately what tribes hope to do and hope to accomplish is to continue to live in their homelands according to their own ways of life, consistent with the teachings that they've learned from their ancestors, and to leave a place that their descendants and their young ones can continue to live and call home. Wado.